Picture yourself standing in the courtyards of the Forbidden City, not today, but more than 18 centuries ago. Silk banners ripple in the breeze as young women are carried past you on ornate stretchers. Their faces are pale, their bodies draped in embroidered robes. Yet it isn't grace that keeps them from walking. Their feet have been broken, crushed, and reshaped until the bones formed what the empire called the Golden Lotus. Walking was impossible. Running, unthinkable. These women could barely stand without someone holding them up. They were living dolls, fragile bodies wrapped in luxury, transported like offerings to satisfy the man called the Son of Heaven. But the imperial harem system was never just about pleasure. It was a machine. A cold, methodical institution designed not only to dominate women's bodies, but to break their spirits. Every jewel, every silk curtain, every golden hall concealed one of the most refined torture systems the ancient world ever produced. The story you are about to hear doesn't come from rumor. It is stitched together from imperial records, the testimonies of palace servants, and even archaeological discoveries buried beneath the very stones tourists walk on today. Together, they reveal how one of the mightiest empires on earth used human sexuality as a weapon of political control for nearly 2,000 years. The scale alone is staggering. During the later Han dynasty, rulers such as Emperor An and Emperor Ji presided over harems with more than 20,000 women locked inside the palace walls. Centuries later, Ming sovereigns maintained their own courts with 9,000 concubines at a time, most of them taken from families across the empire. These were not rare incidents or temporary indulgences. This was systematic human trafficking, sanctioned by law and wrapped in the language of divine mandate. The process that fed this machine was as cruel as it was bureaucratic. Every household in the empire lived under the shadow of the eunuch conscriptions, the elegant name given to the mass selection of girls for palace service. Government officials swept through provinces like storms, armed with quotas and ledgers. No village was safe. Girls as young as 13 were inspected, their teeth, skin, and hair examined as if they were livestock. A blemish, a limp, a trace of malnutrition could disqualify them. For some parents, this was the only way to protect their daughters. Families disfigured their own children on purpose, adding scars, deliberately stunting their growth with strange concoctions, even breaking bones, anything to make them undesirable. Think about that for a moment. Loving mothers mutilating their own children, believing it was the only way to save them from the emperor's gaze. Communities learned to hide their most beautiful girls in caves, in dense forests, or beneath floorboards when imperial scouts approached. Underground networks formed. Desperate attempts to shield children from the state itself. But when a girl was taken, when her name was marked in the red ink of government registers, her fate was sealed. She vanished behind the vermilion gates of the Forbidden City, into a world no one ever returned from. And once inside those walls, the true nightmare began. The palace was a prison dressed as a paradise. Every comfort came with invisible chains. Every gift, every robe, every meal carried its own threat. The harem hierarchy was meticulously engineered to prevent unity among the women. Concubines were sorted into rigid ranks with elaborate titles, each determining the smallest details of their existence, from the food they ate to the colors they were allowed to wear. A single promotion could mean the difference between warmth and starvation, between velvet cushions and cold stone floors. This system bred jealousy like a poison. Women were forced into constant competition, their rivalries encouraged by design. A united sisterhood would be dangerous, but a divided harem was easy to control. Even the emperor's most private moments were weaponized. Secretaries recorded his every encounter with vermilion ink, cataloguing his nights as carefully as generals recorded battles. Entire calendars were designed around bedchamber schedules, rotating concubines with the same precision as crop cycles. Before each imperial visit, women were stripped and bathed in concoctions prescribed by court doctors, their bodies examined like animals at a market. Their most intimate functions logged in official documents that survive in archives to this day. Sexuality wasn't private here. It was a state resource, managed with the same obsessive detail as tax collection or grain storage. But the most devastating torture was psychological. Most women spent their entire lives inside the palace without ever meeting the emperor. They lived in a state of permanent anticipation, years of preparing for an audience that never came. That constant waiting corroded the mind. Communication with the outside world was forbidden. Families were erased from memory. Friendships within the palace? Dangerous. Any bond could be betrayed for advancement. Rivals poisoned each other's meals, slipped toxins into cosmetics, bribed eunuchs to eliminate competitors. And yet, for the few who caught the emperor's eye, life became even more perilous. A single taste of favor made a concubine the target of endless plots. Meals were tested by servants who sometimes died themselves from poisoned food. Pregnancy, instead of joy, became a death sentence. Rivals would go to any length to prevent another woman from producing an heir. Palace medical records whisper of countless miscarriages, stillbirths, and sudden infant deaths. But many of these were not accidents. They were deliberate infanticides, carried out by concubines desperate to keep their own place in the emperor's gaze. This was not romance. This was not luxury. This was a battlefield, a silent war fought in silk corridors where poison, paranoia, and fear ruled every breath. And at the center of it all stood the eunuchs, men who had been mutilated as children, stripped of their manhood so they could be trusted as guardians of imperial women. But far from harmless, many grew into monsters themselves. Their anger and desire for power twisted into cruelty that became legendary. Eunuchs sold palace positions, extorted bribes, and used crude devices to violate the very women they were meant to protect. Some rose to such heights of power that they were feared across the empire. Names like Lu Jin and the group known as the Eight Tigers still echo in Chinese history as symbols of corruption and terror. Inside those vermilion walls, life was not lived, it was survived. The most chilling part of this palace machine was how murder itself became normalized. Within those vermilion walls, ending another woman's life was not a crime, it was a career strategy. Concubines became masters of poison, slipping lethal powders into food, drinks, even perfumes. A smile across the banquet table could hide a death sentence. Cosmetics were laced with toxins, bath oils with venom. A rival's cough could be mistaken for illness, but often it was the first sign of a carefully planned assassination. The archives record the story of Lady Zhao, a childless favorite of Emperor Xuanhua. Obsessed with keeping the emperor's attention for herself, she systematically targeted his other women. Infants vanished, mothers were found dead, rivals collapsed at feasts. Lady Zhao's ambition left a trail of tiny coffins scattered through the palace nurseries. In her desperation, she didn't just kill to survive, she killed to dominate. The palace became a killing field disguised as paradise. Women cultivated arsenals of deadly plants, studied the art of blending powders that left no taste, and experimented with slow-working poisons that mimicked natural illness. They were trapped in a world where survival meant becoming an expert in murder. And all of this rested upon the broken feet that made escape impossible. The cruel art of foot-binding had created permanent prisoners. Bones shattered and reformed into grotesque shapes, meant to symbolize beauty. Every painful step was a reminder of vulnerability, a symbol of ownership. Even if a concubine dreamed of fleeing, she could never outrun her captors. The lotus-shaped feet were both ornament and shackle. This was not an ancient custom that vanished in some distant past. The imperial harem system endured into the 20th century. Within living memory, families still spoke of daughters who disappeared behind palace gates, their names erased while the Forbidden City shone as a monument to imperial power. But the system didn't survive unchanged. Over the centuries, its cruelty evolved, refining itself into forms almost unimaginable. The 16th century brought the darkest chapter, yet a moment when the women themselves decided to strike back. It was called the Renyin Plot. 16 palace women, broken by years of humiliation, whispered of rebellion. They had been tortured, starved, beaten into submission, but desperation lit a fire stronger than fear. Their target was none other than Emperor Jia Shen, a ruler whose sadism had turned the palace into a laboratory of pain. This emperor was obsessed with Taoist alchemy. He believed immortality could be brewed not from metals or herbs, but from human bodies. He became convinced that consuming mixtures made from the menstrual blood of virgin girls would grant him eternal life. And so, girls as young as 13 were imprisoned in hidden chambers, fed only mulberry leaves and dew water. Their bodies were turned into experiments. Physicians monitored every cycle, every drop, every breath. These children weren't treated as human beings. They were reduced to ingredients. The women of the harem endured the emperor's violence daily. They were beaten into obedience, forced to play roles in his depraved rituals. For many, survival meant shutting their minds away, retreating inward, while their bodies were used like objects. But 16 concubines decided silence was no longer enough. One night, as the emperor prepared for another ritual, they struck. They pinned him down, a ribbon from one woman's hair looped around his throat. Hands trembled with desperation as they tried to tighten the knot. When it failed, they grabbed a curtain cord and pulled with every ounce of strength their frail bodies had left. But terror destroys precision. In their panic, they tied the wrong knot. The noose would not close. The emperor gasped for air but lived. One conspirator, overcome by fear, betrayed the others to Empress Fang. The fate of the 16 was sealed. Their punishment was worse than death. They were sentenced to Lingxi, the death of 1,000 cuts. Dragged before the court, their flesh was sliced piece by piece, the execution stretching into hours. They screamed, not only for themselves but for their families, because imperial law decreed that blood relatives shared their fate. Entire households were torn apart in public executions, turned into spectacles meant to entertain crowds and terrify future generations. The message was clear. Resistance was hopeless. Defiance would be punished, not just with death, but with erasure, with annihilation so complete that even your family name was destroyed. But the horror did not end with the executions. The emperor's obsession with alchemy grew darker still. His red lead ritual demanded a constant supply of virgin blood. Girls too young to understand what was happening to them were drained and discarded. Archaeologists have uncovered burial pits within the palace grounds, filled with the skeletal remains of malnourished adolescents. Their bones bear the unmistakable marks of systematic abuse. The palace had become a factory for suffering, grinding human lives into dust in the service of one man's delusion. And the eunuchs, the castrated guardians of the harem, were not bystanders. Many became predators themselves. Stripped of their manhood as boys, they developed grotesque ways of reclaiming power. Some fashioned iron devices to abuse the concubines, leaving injuries so severe that women died on their beds. Court documents record these deaths as mere administrative notes, as if they were routine accidents. Chief eunuchs like Lu Zhen wielded such influence that emperors themselves were afraid to confront them. They created internal hierarchies of abuse, tormenting not only women but also younger eunuchs beneath them. Punishments became spectacles of cruelty, acts of violence masquerading as discipline. The Forbidden City had turned into a sealed ecosystem of trauma. Victims became perpetrators. Pain was recycled, handed down from one rank to another, until no one within those walls was untouched by corruption. Women learned to survive, not by resisting, but by adapting. They developed ways to dissociate, to retreat deep into their minds while smiling and laughing through assaults. Some mastered the art of strategic pregnancy, timing conception to moments of imperial favor while secretly using herbal methods to control fertility. Others trained their bodies to recognize the faintest trace of poison, exposing themselves in tiny doses to build immunity. It was survival through science, through cunning, through sheer will. But the greatest weapon in this dark game wasn't poison, or knives, or even eunuchs. It was hope. The palace kept hope alive deliberately. Women were told that advancement was possible, that obedience might be rewarded, that suffering was the price of eventual power. Ceremonies celebrated new ranks with religious grandeur. Titles were handed out like golden chains, convincing women that they were ascending when in truth, they were sinking deeper into hell. Hope was the empire's sharpest blade, because hope turned victims into willing participants in their own destruction. The palace was not only a prison of silk and stone, it was a laboratory. Behind its vermilion gates, medicine itself was twisted into an instrument of control. Court physicians, sworn to heal, became unwilling collaborators in a program of systematic torture. They were ordered to alter women's bodies not for health, but for pleasure. Records describe procedures designed to heighten sensitivity in some areas, while deadening sensation in others. Imagine surgery performed without anesthesia, on women who were fully awake, their screams echoing down marble corridors. These operations weren't seen as cruelty, they were considered refinement, a way to engineer perfect companions for the emperor. The medical notes read like instruction manuals for assembling objects rather than treating human beings. Concubines were catalogued as specimens, their physical traits logged, adjusted, and sometimes discarded when they no longer suited imperial taste. Even food was turned into a weapon. Meals were crafted not only for nutrition but for manipulation. Dishes were laced with aphrodisiacs, stimulants, or sedatives depending on what the emperor demanded. Some women ate in constant fear, never knowing whether the sweet fragrance rising from their bowl would bring ecstasy, exhaustion, or death. The robes they wore became another form of restraint. Flowing garments, praised for their elegance, were designed to restrict movement. Layers of heavy fabric slowed their steps, weighed them down, and emphasized their helplessness. Beauty and bondage had been sewn together until they were indistinguishable. This was the empire's genius. Cruelty disguised as splendor. The system made its victims participate in their own oppression, convincing them that submission was sacred, that suffering was noble. But not every woman surrendered. Within the palace, invisible networks of resistance slowly formed. Concubines developed codes, silent languages woven into flowers, embroidery, even the placement of hairpins. A chrysanthemum arranged in a vase might warn of poison in the evening's meal. A pattern of stitches on a robe could signal betrayal. These tiny acts of communication became lifelines in a place where open speech could mean death. Servants sometimes risked their lives to carry hidden messages. A folded fan might conceal a warning. A misplaced teacup could indicate danger. Over time, a shadow society emerged within the palace walls, one that operated beneath the gaze of eunuchs and overseers. These networks were not built overnight. Some women spent decades creating them, carefully earning trust, planting signals, teaching younger arrivals how to read them. Many never lived to see their efforts bear fruit. But each act of quiet defiance proved that even in the darkest conditions, the human spirit sought connection. The empire, however, always adapted. It invested as much in psychological warfare as it did in architecture or armies. Imperial scholars conducted experiments that sound less like history and more like the blueprint of a dystopian novel. They studied stress responses, testing how long women could endure isolation before their minds broke. They forced mothers to live apart from their infants, recording how separation increased attachment. They documented the effects of starvation, exhaustion, and deprivation, as if the harem were nothing more than a laboratory cage. These weren't rare exceptions. Surviving documents reveal methodical trials, with categories, outcomes, and recommendations. Women weren't seen as individuals, but as data points in a cruel science of domination. The goal was simple: create submission so complete it looked like desire. Concubines were conditioned through endless ritual. Day after day, they practiced bows, gestures, and smiles, until obedience became instinct. They were trained to respond to commands without thought, to perform devotion as easily as breathing. Some were drilled in 17 different styles of tears: happy tears, grateful tears, longing tears, so that even their sorrow could be staged as entertainment. One record tells of a concubine known only as May, who perfected the art of weeping. She could summon tears at will, shaping them into a performance that flattered the emperor's ego. Her suffering became a spectacle, her emotions rehearsed until even pain was choreographed. Behind these rehearsals lay the empire's most devastating weapon: psychological profiling. Court officials kept detailed files on every concubine: her fears, her desires, her weaknesses. Informants reported every conversation, every glance, every hesitation. By the time a woman entered the emperor's presence, he knew her secrets better than she did. Imagine living under that scrutiny. Every word you spoke could be twisted, every gesture recorded. Even silence was dangerous, because silence might be interpreted as rebellion. The palace reduced its women to experiments in behavior modification, a system that blurred the line between torture and science. It wasn't enough to control their bodies. The empire wanted their souls. Yet, in this suffocating nightmare, women still carved out slivers of resistance. They poisoned themselves in small doses to build immunity. They faked pregnancies to buy time. They whispered warnings into the ears of younger girls, preparing them for a life of suspicion and deceit. The harem was a place where survival required intelligence sharper than any blade. Every smile had to be calculated, every step rehearsed, every word weighed. One mistake could mean ruin, but careful cunning could secure another day, another month, another chance to endure. And so the palace functioned not only as a prison, but as a crucible. It melted away innocence and forged cunning in its place. Some women became strategists, others assassins. Still others master manipulators of emotion. Those who survived longest learned to weaponize their suffering, turning tears into power, turning weakness into armor. But beneath the layers of silk and ceremony, beneath the endless rituals and performances, one truth echoed louder than all others. This was not a palace of beauty. It was a factory of obedience. A place where women's bodies were redesigned, their minds dissected, their spirits broken and rebuilt. A system so refined in its cruelty that even hope itself was poisoned, because hope kept them alive just long enough to be destroyed. The cruelest invention of the imperial harem wasn't poison, or whips, or even the eunuchs. It was hierarchy. The palace had discovered a way to turn victims into guards, forcing women to enforce the very chains that bound them. Senior concubines, those who had survived years of abuse, were rewarded with authority over the younger ones. What followed was a cycle of cruelty so insidious that the empire barely needed to intervene. These senior women became specialists in psychological warfare. They knew precisely how to break a new arrival, because they had endured the same process themselves. Their training programs made the punishments of eunuchs seem crude by comparison. They identified weaknesses like hunters tracking prey. A girl who feared abandonment would be isolated. One, terrified of pain, would be forced into endless drills that blurred the line between ritual and torture. Another, who longed for affection, would be manipulated with false kindness, only to have it ripped away at the crucial moment. This was domination customized. Torture tailored not to the body, but to the soul. Concubines were drilled in elaborate submission routines, hours upon hours of rehearsed devotion. They practiced how to smile when they wanted to scream, how to appear aroused when they felt only fear, how to laugh on command as if joy were a switch to be flipped. A woman named Lin, recorded in palace documents, spent 3 years perfecting a single role, the art of appearing grateful. She learned to bow with trembling sincerity, to let tears fall as if overwhelmed by the emperor's generosity, to mask disgust with devotion. Her performances were so convincing that she gained a reputation for loyalty, though in truth she was merely surviving. The empire understood something modern psychology would later confirm, that repeated conditioning reshapes the mind. By forcing women to perform submission daily, they blurred the line between acting and reality. Some began to believe their own performances. Others retreated so far into dissociation that their identities fractured into pieces. The harem wasn't just a prison, it was a theater where survival required constant performance. But the manipulation didn't stop there. Imperial scribes compiled psychological profiles on every woman. These dossiers recorded fears, desires, friendships, and hidden resentments. Eunuchs and spies updated them constantly, reporting even the smallest signs of hesitation or defiance. The emperor and his advisors often knew more about a concubine's inner life than she knew herself. Imagine living under such surveillance. Every word weighed, every glance documented, every silence analyzed. There was no escape, not in the gardens, not in the baths, not even in dreams, for even sleep offered no relief. Nightmares haunted women who had been conditioned to obey in both body and mind. The most devastating discovery was how hope itself became the weapon of choice. Promotions within the harem hierarchy were celebrated with pageantry and sacred ceremony. Women believed they were ascending toward divinity, when in truth they were sinking deeper into bondage. This was the empire's genius, making oppression feel like reward. Every act of compliance was dangled with the possibility of advancement, better food, warmer quarters, new titles, even the emperor's fleeting glance. These tiny rewards kept women clinging to the system, convinced that if they endured just a little longer, they might reach safety. But safety never came. Advancement only meant greater danger, greater exposure, greater vulnerability. The higher a woman climbed, the sharper the knives aimed at her back. The palace had transformed survival into a lottery. The prize wasn't freedom, it was slightly less suffering, and desperate women would do anything for a winning ticket. The most insidious part was how the system convinced women to police each other. Senior concubines punished disobedience among juniors, often with methods more creative and cruel than those of eunuchs. A new girl who resisted might be denied food, kept awake for nights, or forced to perform exhausting rituals until her body collapsed. Others were humiliated in front of peers, their dignity shredded to break their will. No imperial decree was necessary. The cycle sustained itself, and once a woman rose to power, she faced a choice: continue the cruelty, or risk becoming its victim again. Most chose survival, passing down their trauma to the next generation of arrivals. The palace didn't need constant oversight, because it had built a machine that maintained itself. This was trauma institutionalized, oppression industrialized. Even the arts of beauty were turned into instruments of control. Hairstyles were coded to display rank, jewelry carefully rationed according to hierarchy. A misplaced ornament could be interpreted as rebellion. A robe stitched in the wrong color might lead to punishment. Women's very appearances became uniforms of submission. Yet beneath the surface, rebellion still simmered. Some women faked devotion while quietly building alliances. Others feigned illness to avoid the emperor's bed, hiding herbal contraceptives or disguising miscarriages. A few found ways to pass secret information to sympathetic servants or even sympathetic eunuchs. These acts were rare, fragile, and dangerous. But they were proof that even within the empire's most refined system of domination, resistance refused to die. Still, for every act of defiance, there were countless more of betrayal. Spies lurked in every corridor, rivals ready to sell each other's secrets for a taste of advancement. In a world where trust was suicide, paranoia became survival. The palace did not need to chain women in iron. It chained them with fear, with hope, with hierarchy, with the promise that one day, if they just obeyed enough, they might be safe. That day never came, because safety was never the goal. The empire wanted not only obedience, but transformation. It wanted to remake human beings into instruments, tools of imperial desire, pawns in the emperor's endless game of power. And the Forbidden City, so admired today for its beauty, was the stage where this transformation unfolded, day after day, year after year, for centuries. Behind every carved dragon and golden roof was a story of a woman forced to kneel, to smile, to cry on command. Behind every silk curtain was a secret history of betrayal, poisoning, and psychological torment. It wasn't paradise. It was hell, written in vermilion ink and staged with divine ceremony. The most devastating truth about the harem system wasn't its violence. It wasn't the poison, the whips, or even the mutilations. It was how completely it rewrote human beings. Inside those vermilion walls, women were not merely controlled, they were remade. The palace operated as a factory of obedience, producing generation after generation of concubines trained to believe that suffering was sacred, that submission was divine. And the genius of the system was that it forced women themselves to become its instruments. Senior concubines, once victims, became the enforcers of rituals that shattered newcomers. Eunuchs, mutilated in childhood, became predators whose cruelty rivaled that of emperors. Even physicians, sworn to heal, became engineers of pain. It was a closed ecosystem of trauma, where every inhabitant was both victim and perpetrator, prisoner and warden. The empire had perfected the art of turning cruelty into culture. New arrivals were not simply imprisoned. They were rebuilt through psychological conditioning so precise it would make modern cult deprogramming seem merciful. Girls were drilled until their bodies responded automatically to commands, until their smiles appeared without thought, until their tears flowed on cue. They were trained to see obedience not as slavery, but as destiny. Ceremonies reinforced this illusion. Promotions within the hierarchy were staged like sacred rituals, complete with music, incense, and pageantry. Women knelt in awe as peers received new titles, convinced they were witnessing ascension toward the heavens, when in reality, they were watching someone sink deeper into a pit. This was the empire's sharpest blade, not torture, not poison, but hope. Hope convinced women to police one another. Hope convinced them to endure just one more year, one more ritual, one more humiliation, in the belief that reward would come. It never did. The system dangled survival like a prize, and in chasing it, women sustained the very machinery that destroyed them. Even resistance was co-opted. Alliances formed, but trust was fragile. Every friend could be a spy. Every smile could conceal betrayal. The palace did not need chains when paranoia kept women bound more tightly than iron ever could. And this cycle endured not for years, not for decades, but for centuries. From the Han to the Qing, the system adapted, refined, perfected itself. Emperors came and went, dynasties rose and fell, but the palace endured, always hungry, always consuming. By the time the last dynasty collapsed in 1911, millions of women had passed through its gates, their names erased, their lives reduced to ash. Today, tourists wander the courtyards of the Forbidden City. They marvel at the carved dragons, the lacquered beams, the endless golden roofs gleaming beneath the sunday. Guides speak of emperors, of battles, of politics and art. Few mention the countless women whose bones lie beneath those stones, women who were not wives or lovers, but prisoners. The architecture dazzles, but beneath its beauty lies a silence built from screams no one was allowed to hear. The imperial harem was not an anomaly. It was not an aberration of history, tucked away in a forgotten corner. It was a system so vast, so enduring, that it shaped Chinese society for nearly 2 millennia. It blurred the boundaries between power and intimacy, between love and domination, until they were indistinguishable. The emperors didn't just want pleasure, they wanted proof of their divinity, to dominate not only a woman's body, but her mind, her spirit, her very identity, to transform intimacy into an instrument of governance, and obedience into a form of worship. The Forbidden City, admired today for its splendor, was built on forgotten graves. Its beauty conceals a history written in suffering, a reminder of how unchecked power corrupts every corner of human life. And this is why the story of the harem still matters, because it shows us how easily cruelty can disguise itself as beauty, how control can masquerade as devotion, how systems can endure for centuries, sustained not only by rulers, but by the very victims they consume. When we gaze at those crimson walls today, we are not just looking at history, we are looking at a warning that power, once unchecked, can twist even the most intimate human connections into tools of domination. A warning that suffering can be hidden behind silk, jewels, and ceremony. A warning that what we call civilization can rest on foundations of cruelty. The harem system was not paradise. It was hell. A hell where beauty was bondage, where intimacy was weaponized, and where the only thing more terrifying than torture was hope. And though centuries have passed, its echoes remain, reminders carved into stone, painted across golden roofs, whispered in the silence of courtyards, where thousands of women once prayed for a freedom that never came. The forbidden city stands, but beneath its brilliance lie shadows that can never be erased.